Hi class, welcome to Module 10. And this week is a little different because the case we are studying is my own. So the two chapters your groups are reading come from my dissertation, and this video gives you the study behind them. And watch it early and closely because it carries the context you will need to read well. And in the second half, I present my own section of chapter 5. So I did not share these chapters so you will agree with me. I shared them so you could watch an ethnography's case study build and then test whether it holds. And again, I prefer the stakes to be mine than with other study, and having the author and the professor in the same room. I think that is a great opportunity to ask all the questions that we want to ask before we engage with ethnography as part of our dissertations or masters or projects in the future. So treat this study as an example and not as a template. As you read, the useful question is not, is she right? It is, where does this case earn its claims? And where will I want more as a reader? And that is the work this week. And it is exactly the kind of critique that I'm inviting. So please do not worry about it. So the study took place at East Summer High, a public high school northwest of Boston. And it went over what, through roughly 3 years or a little bit more, with 22 and 23 being the school year that was the core of the study. I follow six multilingual SEI teachers closely: Prophet Blumberg, Prophet Sandrionori, Prophet Blanchard, Prophet Medina, Prophet O'Connor, and Prophet Gaffey, who work inside a larger team of about 20 SEI teachers. And at No That Matters Ethically, these teachers choose to keep the real last names. And I will come back to why that was their decision to make. So I want you to see them, and I want you to see the real people behind the study. And they agreed to do this with me. So these are the six teachers at the heart of this study. They appear here as themselves with their real names and their real faces. And that was their decision to make and not mine. We talked about it and we agreed that it mattered. This research is about flesh and blood people doing work that matters and is not treated as an anonymous data point. Some of what the larger study found was hard, and naming a difficult pattern in someone's practice is part of the honest ethnography. But telling the truth and honoring the person are not intention. I try to hold them both. Now, you will also notice that while the teachers appear as themselves, the students do not. Every student is pseudonymized, and every student and family gave me informed consent. The adults chose to be visible, the young people are protected. So that difference is deliberate. And I ask the same care of you this week. Be critical of how the cases build and keep these phases in view while you do it. So the data from my study came from several sources over the year. Classroom observations across ESL and content classes, plus observations, so the team meetings, professional developments that I created and run, and school activities. Interviews with teacher at multiple points of the year, I also collected teacher journals and a large body of artifacts. I also have lesson plans and student work, newsletters, and PD materials. So no single source carry the argument. The case is built from where these sources agree and from where they rub against each other. So let me be clear about who was doing this looking because it shaped what I saw. And I am a multilingual scholar from Colombia. I work across English and Spanish, teaching classrooms. And I came to these classrooms as both a researcher and practitioner, facilitating professional development and mentoring multilingual youth alongside my field work. I have an special interest in youth. I think that is a very important age to study. And in our field, there are many gaps concerning youth. So that hybrid position gave me access and also a blind spot. The classroom talk felt familiar, and I nearly missed how strategically these teachers were deploying their languages. So, watch as you read for where my closeness sharpens the account and where it might narrow it. So, two questions drove this study. The first is about identity, how these teachers understand themselves and how their histories and journeys shape the voices they make. The second is about practice, what multilingual practices they build in the classroom and how they negotiate the obstacles. If you are in Group A with Chapter 4, you are in the territory of the first question. If you are in Group B with Chapter 5, you are in the second. And notice the hinge. Question 1B. The moment a teacher adopts her resources to meet a student's needs is where identity turns into practice. That is exactly where your two chapters meet. So, how did I make sense of everything that I gathered and I collected during my ethnographic years? So, analytically, I read these classrooms through second generation cultural historical activity theory, which asks where the contradictions sits in a system between policy, community, and the teacher's own agency. That framework is what constructs like self-exception and dislocation in chapter 4, and the Cariño practices in chapter 5 are built up from the data rather than assumed at the start. As you trace the case, notice that move. A construct is a claim and it has to be earned from evidence. So here is how your two chapters fit together. Chapter 4 is about identity, what these teachers carry. Chapter 5 is about practice, what they do. Chapter 5 draws on Curry's model of authentic cariño, which has three dimensions: familial, intellectual, and critical. And building on Valenzuela's and Roland Dahl, your group mates take familial, intellectual cariño. My section is the critical cariño. So my section is the third form, what is called critical cariño, and familial and intellectual cariño, which your groups may cover, are about relationships and rigor. Critical cariño is care with a political edge. So following Curry, it treats students' languages as identities and emancipatory tools. It does not just comfort students, it equips them to read questions and act on the inequities of their own lives. Care and critique in the same breath. So across the chapter, I follow a single or I start the chapter with a day in Professor Blumber's classroom. And if you pay attention to chapter 5, it has three different vignettes that are one single day covering Professor Blumber's classroom. If you're curious about what I did that, ask me that question in the discussion and I will explain to you. So I show that day in layers, one vignette for each kind of cariño. You are watching the third layer, the critical one. The class is reading a poem, No Girls Allowed, and Prophet Blumber asks in two languages at once what the connection is and what the important idea is. Students answer fluidly across Spanish, Portuguese, and English, and he treats every language as legitimate. Then he pushes past the poem and he asks, what do you see day to day? And that is what is the difference? Like, what do you see day to day in the difference between men and women? And a student says the boys are afraid. Afraid of what? He asked. And a student said of losing. And he says, losing what? Pressing the students. And he asked the game of the power. And a student lands it. If the girls play better, the boys do not want that. In a few minutes, in their own languages, these students move from a poem to an analysis of how privilege protects itself. That is critical cariño. The multilingualism in that case is not a decoration, is the vehicle for the critique. So Prophet Blumber is not alone. Across the team, the practice took four shapes, challenging the idea that English is the only legitimate language of school, connecting content to students' actual lives, from a physics lesson on humidity and heating bills to knowing where the food pantry is, opening hard debates and letting students lead them, like three students arguing over whether homework is fair when one of them works after school and cares for a younger sibling, and holding complexity without flattening. One exchange, in one exchange, I will show you Profe Gaffey and a student named Emmanuel reading The Breadwinner, moving between languages until Emmanuel says, El Salvador es difícil como Afganistán. El Salvador is as difficult as Afghanistan, and reads his own migration through the book. That is a student becoming, in his own words, both a survivor and an analyst. So here is my argument, and the part that I want you to weigh most carefully. Curry gave us three kinds of cariño. What I add is that they do not sit in separate boxes or circles. What connects them, what lets them, or what lets a teacher move from the comfort to rigor to critique inside a single conversation is translanguaging. And I call it the corriente, the current. It's not my own construct. I call it the corriente, or I use better. I employ the term of corriente or the current because the languages flowing through the rune are carry the care across all three dimensions. That claim is my contribution, and that is exactly the kind of claim you should test against the evidence I have given you. So let me separate what I borrow from what I claim. The corriente comes from the literature on translanguaging. That is a Ofelia Garcia's construct. I did not originate that idea. And I want on the record that before anyone asks. And what I'm claiming in my dissertation is the mechanism, and it is the sharper claim. These two things co-occur. So cariño is not a parallel virtue sitting beside translanguaging in these classrooms. It is the condition that makes translanguaging possible. Students reach across their languages because the relationships makes the risk survivable. Authentic caring, political clarity, culturally sustaining pedagogy all sit near this. So press me on the difference. They treat care and language as companion commitments. I am arguing a dependency. And here is the boundary, because it follows directly from the claim. If the argument is about how multilingualism functions for the students, then the student experience is the evidence, and my data is entirely on the teacher's side. This study can show how Prophet Blumberg builds the conditions, but it cannot show you how students receive them. So including students is not a scope regret. It is the test this framework still has to pass. So I could prove that it is what I said that it is. And it is the study that I owe you next. So this week, read your chapter in full. Follow your leaders through it, and use the building moves lens to ask how this case is constructed. This is our opportunity to look back and bring in all the readings that I've been doing in this course and apply it to this case study. The reach across to then the idea is to reach to the other group, group A or group B, because chapter 4 and chapter 5 are two halves of one study. And the real question is whether they hold each other up. So class, I'm looking forward to what you notice. Let me know in your discussions, and I'm looking forward to read you and to see what are you thinking. Thank you for another amazing week. Have a great week. See you soon.